So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. The weather is a lot nicer outside, so it's always nice to have you here since it's very attractive to be out there in a sunny and not so cold day. So today we're going to talk about Genesis, and we welcome Marco Magalhaes to give us that talk. Before that, we're going to have our initial reading with Iago, and then that will be followed by our initial prayer with Raquel.
Give yourself a good appearance, so far as possible without the excessive care of a mannequin or the carelessness of a slob. Clothes are made for man, not man for clothes. Fashions are caprices of the market to make money. They stimulate people's folly and immaturity. A neat outfit that protects the body, even if out of fashion, is better than the latest model on display, which is often ridiculous. Do not worry about not being in fashion, since fashion is always transitory.
So let's now close our eyes. Elevate our thought to our Master Jesus and all the spiritual friends that are present here. Let's thank them for the opportunity of being here one more time together and ask them to open our minds and our hearts for the lecture of today, that we may absorb as much as possible in order to help us to become better humans. Thank you, so be it.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see a nice packed house. Today we're going to talk about Genesis. And I'm based pretty much everything that I'm talking about today, surprisingly or not, is coming from one single book. And that's the book of Genesis by Allan Kardec, which was published in 1868. I think the first thing for us is really to go back and try to imagine 1868. Maybe some of us were alive at that time, but so this is a year when, the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution was proclaimed and confirmed. So for civil rights movements, the state is now cannot treat people differently. Sounds amazing, right? The element helium was discovered by a very well-known scientist called Jansen. And the way he did that is looking at solar eclipses. Like, so people look at it as like, just something of like some type of amusement. At that time, he was able to trace a frequency of light that no other element so far discovered on Earth was able to detect. And by correlating that frequency, he was able to come up with a new element that now we know so well because we love balloons that fly, right? Balloons that go up in the atmosphere. So they're all helium based, right? Because it's lighter than air. No one knew that, right? So that was discovered in 1868. And, many other things happened. We have the first impeachment of the 17th American president that happened in 1868. Now we're in 2018, and guess what? A lot of countries are going through impeachments. Civil rights movements are still fighting over whether people have to be treated differently or not. And we're still discovering a lot of things that we had no idea existed. So things actually never really changed that much. And just as a proof of that, we're talking about Genesis again. And we've been talking about Genesis since we actually started to develop our own consciousness. Because what's the most critical question that we're actually not able to prove scientifically completely yet is how things started. Have you ever caught yourself thinking about this? We're so critical about understanding whether something that you're eating is GMO or not, or if the seed is this or that, how it was raised. But we can't even think whether, how were we created? And this is a lot about what we're going to be talking about today, because the book of Genesis brings really the science of everything. It is a very interesting approach by Kardec, generating hypotheses, questions, and proving them through the knowledge from spirits and also his own knowledge on searching things at that time in 1868. And the first thing he approaches, so the book itself, we can divide it in 3 parts. And the very first thing that he mentions in the book, and that's also from the Spirit's book, as you can see here in question 799, is that Spiritism, the idea behind what we're doing and what he was doing, is to help humankind improve their moral and intellectual progress. Because they have to come side by side. If you study enough and you're absolutely genius in the intellectual aspect, but you don't know how to apply that, that can be quite dangerous. If you develop your moral, but you fail to understand the consequences of why you're doing this and how can you do it better, there's a point that you don't go any further. It limits your potential. So they always have to come together. And obviously all of us will think about the story of the bird that can only fly with 2 wings, right? And if you think that way, moral and intellectual development are the wings of a bird. If you have one or the other, it doesn't really go well. If you have both at the same time, then you really start to think about real evolution, in a sense of evolution. So just to show you how, some versions of the Genesis, some of them we have available here, like the little green one here is probably one of the most up-to-date ones that you have in the book there. This is a copy of the original publication of it. And many other variants of it have been published many, many times. And this is the one we have available here. This is the one I based my story on. Obviously, it's been translated and, adapted and published by different sources, different time, although the core elements of the message are obviously the same. If you can read French, you can also actually get a digital copy now of the original version online if you want. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today. Something very important. And I'll tell you in a second. So let me ask you this. What is time? You guys know? What's time? Any ideas? What's in your watch? Maybe. No? I don't know what's my watch tracking. It's tracking me probably. Have you guys actually thought about this before? What is time? Yes, go ahead. Motion. That's. I think that's an interesting thought. Yeah. In relation to what? So it means if I move faster, if I move slowly, or if I move. But, for example, I'll give you a good perspective on motion, because we measure time by motion. That's absolutely right, because we measure how many times our little planet goes around over itself. And over the moon or over the sun. So so by measuring that and keep track of that, we pace ourselves. So if I tell you that it's been 24 hours and you tell me, oh yeah, our planet has completed an entire revolution against its own axis, that's 24 hours and a few seconds, right? But what does that mean? So if I live in Jupiter, then my day is like 10 times my day today, and my year is like 10 years of years Earth time. So if you talk to a spirit that never lived on Earth and tell that spirit that you have 2 hours to do this, what does that mean? He's gonna look at you as like, what 2 hours actually mean? Because that's exactly how we understand time, is based on relative aspects of our existence. So I can see light in the sky, and then I don't see light in the sky again. When I see the light back up, that's a day. That's how I keep track of time. But if I travel the light speed, then I live in a different time than you. So time is relative. Einstein was very good creating that theory, because in the relativity theory, he described to us that space and time they actually both relative and they can be changed at any given time. So time is a measure of space, but it's a space between events. Right? So there's one event that happens today and another event that happens another time. I can keep track of the difference between those two events, and that's a measure of time. So time is relative, space is relative. Now that I've confused your minds completely about time and you have no idea how to answer the same question I asked you before, I ask you an even more complicated question. So when did time start? See, what I'm doing here is to show you what Kardec had in mind when he was writing this book. You think it was easy? He had the questions I'm asking you are exactly the same questions Kardec had when he was actually approaching the spirits and trying to put this book together. Like, what is time? When did time start? Our science also tackled those questions. But obviously we cannot prove by an experiment when time started. We don't have the means to do that. We can't even design an experiment to do that. But I can tell you that philosophically, through years and through theology and a lot of understanding from the spirits, we know that time and space were created at the same time. That's when our universe was created. So there was nothing before. And then the universe is created. And then that space-time event marks time zero. So there's actually no measure of time before that. Because all we measure time is based on how our universe changes, right? So the sun changes, the galaxy changes. So if you think that way, so for God, which was there before the creation, right? There's no time. He created time zero for us. So we can keep track of that. So when we say that the universe was created like how many billion years ago, that's really we're trying to go back in time and say, okay, so God created the universe that time, and then what happened before that? We don't know. So these are the questions that were brought up in Genesis, and a lot of very, very interesting and challenging questions that really most of us don't even think about this on a daily basis, but I think those are really important questions. Okay, so God created the universe, and what is God? And someone? No? At least one will try? No? Raquel will try? Come on.
It's everything.
It's everything. So can I be my own creation? So let's say I created this book. Let's say I'm not, obviously not, but let's say I created this book here. This is my book. Am I this book? No. So God is not everything. Right? He cannot be his own creation. Right? So this is my creation. But my thought is inside that creation. Right? Because I designed the laws that created that object. Right? So you can see God through his creation. That's the thing. I can. Because I can see God through the perfection of God's laws. But God is not its own creation. Can you guys follow that? Okay. But it didn't answer my question, so what is God? So I know where I can kind of see God, but it doesn't have a shape or a pattern or a way. I just have a feeling of what he is. So if I believe that the universe is perfect, so by definition, the maximum of perfection has to be God, right? But what is God? No?
First cause of all things.
Yes, it's the first cause of all things. Because everything that is created or every action needs to be an initial cause that generated the action of creation. So, you know, if you think about this, so if I push this book and it falls over, you know, there was an initial starting force that allowed this book to be pushed over, right? So for every action, there is an initial cause, right? So if the universe is created, so an intelligent creation needs to have an intelligent cause. Now, scientists will try to debunk that. And I understand, I'm a scientist. That's what I do for a living. Okay? So I have a lab, I go to work, you know, that's what I do. So this is actually a very interesting point because science does not debunk the fact that laws are created in the universe. So scientists will say that gravity is the cause of all things. Like Stephen Hawking, for example. He's a perfect example of this. What he believes, and I think it's absolutely right, is that the law of gravity governs the behavior in the universe itself. So everything in the universe is somehow regulated by the laws of gravity, for example. You know, how the planets are condensed, how they interact with each other, how we interact with Earth, and Earth interacts with the moon. They're all governed by the law of gravity. And then my next question is, who created the law of gravity? I can guarantee you that a law does not create itself. Because if the law is perfect, then a perfect law cannot be created by chaos. And that's what right now the question of science is, right? So how does chaos can generate a perfect synergistic law? It doesn't allow that, right? So God is, if you believe that there's a scale of perfection, that's easy to understand. So there's things that are not perfect and things that are perfect. So God will be obviously the perfect, the really top of everything. Same thing for intelligence, same thing for love, same thing for everything that we understand today. So that's a very easy way. So do you know who created that whole theory? St. Augustine. He was the one that created the idea of the scaling of things. So if you think about everything in the universe being good or partially good, every scale has a perfectly bad and a perfectly good. So God will be on the side of the perfectly good. So he can only be one, right? Because if you have two most powerful forces in the universe, then the universe automatically has an imbalance of forces. Right? Because two forces that are identical power and might cannot coexist at the same time, because that creates imbalances in the force. Right? Sounds like in Star Wars right now. Okay, so we're trying to understand what's God, but I still didn't answer the question. So what is God? See, this is so interesting because we cannot define God by what God is. We can define God by what we understand in our current understanding, by parameters of perfection of existence. So I know, is God physical? No. God cannot be physical, but he created the physical principles of the universe. So he cannot be part of his own creation. Right? That's simple. So I cannot define exactly what it's made of, how does it look, the size, the shape, the pattern, the color. I can't define any of that. But I can define something very simple. He is the representation of perfection because he created a perfect universe. See, that's easy, right? So we can do that. So we can play the game all day long, and you think about everything that represents the all-powerful, almighty, all-mercy, all-love, then that's God, right? So that's the only way we can define God. Okay, I know God has been defined as, you know, this old smart little gentleman, or, you know, there's different ways. God was a son at some point, and then he was a tree, and then he was a man figure, and then the man figure obviously has to be a wise man, and then he has to be an old man because the old man tends to be wiser, and then because he's an old man, now he has a beard. The beard has to be white because this is how humanity, in lacking the capacity of understanding God, substitute the image of God into things that I can see, touch, and feel. You guys follow that, right? Okay, so in Genesis, so Allan Kardec answers that same question. And everything that I talked about right now represented in one of the chapters of the book, which talks about what is God. That question, remember, it's in the Spirit's book, very first question. Right? So if you think that way, Genesis, which is much later than the Spirit's book, right? We talk about 7 years away. So he pulls the questions from the Spirit's book, which were really like a Q&A session. You know, it's like, what is this? That. What is that? This. What is that? That. So that's Spirit's book. They're short answers, focused questions, like literally, like, what is this? That's the Spirit's book. This book is like, okay, now explain to me what's behind all that. So that's the Genesis. And in the Genesis, we're going to be brought with very interesting concepts of creation. The first one is that we have two main principles that were generated in creation. One that our science does really well in understanding, which is the material principles. The material principle gives rise to all material things in the universe, and it's derived from this type of energy that we cannot measure or understand or touch or feel or see. That's called the universal cosmic principle, fluid, which is right there, the universal cosmic fluid. So God created the universal cosmic fluid. I like to think about chicken soup. That's how I like to see it. So I'm starting a chicken soup. So I put water to boil, right? And then that's universal cosmic fluid. It's in there. It's boiling, right? It's ready to go. But I have no chicken. So I'm going to create a chicken soup. So I put a chicken in. So now that's the material principle. And the love that I'm giving to that soup, that's going to taste so well. You know, grandmas are doing the soup. It's like, oh, this is the soup that I'm doing to my little guy. That's almost like representing the spiritual principle. It's something immaterial, intangible, unrelated to the soup itself, but it's there. It's shared directly from the heart of who's preparing the food to the food itself. So that's an easy way of understanding this, okay? I know Kardec's probably saying, Marco, stop doing this. Like, don't talk about kitchen soup in my... Sorry. But I'll do a better job next time. So I'll think about another soup. So the material principle is literally everything touchable, seeable, you can actually describe and see. So we are very good at understanding material principles because our little material eyes incarnated can see it really well. So we can see a lot of it, right? And science has obviously been for a very, very, very long time trying to understand the initial development sequence of the material principle, which, let's say, the universe. Okay? So, do you know the Big Bang Theory? Like, you know, not the TV show. Okay? Okay, just want to make a disclaimer. Like the scientific side of it, which is how the universe is like the main accepted hypothesis on how the universe was generated. Remember, I call this hypothesis because we can only test it in very limited ways. So we cannot really go out there and prove it like this is exactly what happened, right? But we can kind of come up with a plan of, you know, how to answer this. So do you know why we know that there was some sort of explosion sometime in the universe? Do you guys know how science does that? It's very simple, no? We look at the sky. That's what we do. I'm not an astronomer, but I like reading about it at least. So, it's very simple. So, and I'll give a little history of astronomy now. So I like to give you some histories of everything. So let's go back in time, and let's say we go back to Copernicus, right? So what he did, he was able to look at the sky and realize that there were some stars that moved faster than others. So some sources of light were moving faster than others. So he every night would look at that same pattern. He would divide this route where some, now we know they're planets, but they didn't even know at the time. So planets have specific routes crossing our own sky in a specific pattern and trajectory, some of them faster, some of them slower. So he started to figure that our planet is actually somehow turning, right? And all these other sources of light in the sky, they're likely closer or further away from us, depending on how fast they're moving. Imagine like you drive in a car and you look through a window. So the grass that's just beside the highway, it's going super fast. You can barely see it, right? But relatively to that, if you look at the mountain that's staying far away from your car, it's relatively stable to you because it's far away from your car. So that's one of the principles of physical laws that we know. So things will move relatively faster or slower to your eyes depending on the distance they are from you. So Copernicus knew that. So he looked in the sky, he kind of put the trajectory of things, he realized there are several layers of planets and stars and celestial things that are farther or closer away from us. And then he realized that, well, maybe we're in this planet and there's several layers of things rotating around us. The only thing he got wrong, or partially right, he was the first one to think that the sun was actually the center of the universe, not the earth. Because remember, right before that, people used to think the contrary. The earth was the center. And then Galileo Galilei, that one you know, just like 1606, so it's much before that. So he devised the first way of actually looking at the sky in a more scientific way. And then he proved that we're not the center of the universe and things are rotating around us. Do you know why? He looked at Saturn, he looks at Jupiter and other, several planets, and he realized that in all those bigger planets, there were little things rotating around them. And he knew it because the intensity of light that he was detecting changed in a cyclical pattern. So imagine, like, there's a moon here and a planet here. So if a moon goes around, every time it goes in front of you, the light of the planet goes down a little bit. Isn't that amazing? So we're here concerned whether there's there's this or that, or, if my car is going to start in the winter and anything. And these guys are looking at the sky and devising theories about planets that nowadays we know exactly what happens, but this is 500 years ago, okay? So, putting all that in perspective, now astronomy knows that if I look at the sky the same way, I can see that things tend to be going away from each other. So if I look at the outskirts of our universe, things are going at a much faster speed, and they're going away from each other. And if I look closer to what kind of looks like the center universe, things are not going that fast anymore, but they're still going away from each other. So imagine this. Let's say, your son, let's say, Daniel or someone, is going around with a bucket full of water, okay? And he drops in the floor. So what happens with the splash pattern? Like, there's splash everywhere, right? And there's a radius to it. And the ones at the edges are going to be very far away from each other. The ones very close will be like a little puddle of water. So they look at this and they look at the universe and say, see, this is exactly what's happening. So there was some sort of explosion in the beginning that separated things apart, and we're still being separated apart. So that's why they were able to trace back the differences in speed and trace back the formula that say, okay, this happened a few billion years ago, right? So that's what science knows. Is it wrong? No, this is absolutely right. So that's observational science. I look at the fact, I describe the formula, I test the hypothesis, and I publish, right? So that's science. So in Spiritism now, so again, going back to the Genesis, Kardec explained to us through the spirits and all that, that this is absolutely perfect description of the development of material principle, governed by the laws of God. Law of gravity is a law of God. He created the law. So there's nothing wrong with the law of gravity. No one's questioning it. Okay? But what are we missing from our understanding of the Genesis? Just this. Because that science cannot study or detect or publish on, because we cannot even really detect it. We can't assess it. We cannot create an experiment to prove things on the spiritual principle side of things. And obviously, you just think about this. So, if God is creating this universe and is creating a spiritual principle and a material principle, and they're all growing together. So if I know that the material principle is evolving, it's kind of obvious that the spiritual principle has to evolve too, because everything evolves. That's one basic rule of our universe. Okay? And I know Grace is probably thinking out there, like, Marco, why are you talking about hypotheses and things? I just, but I know. So let's talk less about that now. Let's talk more about interesting things. So, what Genesis also tells us is that the spiritual principle is really not made of a material principle, because the spirit and the matter are not the same. Okay? They have two independent, individual origins, right? The spiritual body, though, comes from the universal cosmic fluid, which is material in essence, right? So the spirit takes on that very subtle material surrounding, a fluid, let's say it that way, and creates a spiritual body. So that's what happens. So if you think that way, so every spirit will have a spiritual body which is similar to where they live. So if I live on earth, my spiritual body tends to be dense, tends to be heavier, because we're in a planet that's still like in the very beginning of evolution, right? So if I go to a much more evolved planet, my spiritual body is so subtle that it doesn't even have a shape anymore, right? Our spiritual body has the exact same shape of our body almost all the time, because that's the level of evolution that we are. So that's why when people say, I saw a spirit, it's like, yes, so you saw the spiritual body of that spirit. Because the spirit itself, you can't really see. It's not even a material thing. It's just immaterial to us, right? Even to our spiritual eyes. So that's interesting, because it tells us, it explains to us, for example, why when people have a nightmare that saw a spirit that looks like a dragon, another one had a spirit that looks like a little ball, that's totally understandable, because the spiritual body can change shape in any point in time as long as the spirit projects it. So if the spirit projects the energy of showing itself in a particular pattern, it will just reshape the spiritual body like we change clothes, right? So see, it explains a lot of things about us. Okay, and I'll have another question. Okay, so I like, today is a day of challenging questions. Okay, so we talked about what is God. So we talked about the universe. So let's talk about something interesting now. So, do you guys believe in aliens? Yes? Why?
Because there's no way for life to be only here.
Good. So there's life somewhere else. I agree with that too. But why do we call them aliens? Yeah. Why? Do we know that? They're spirit just like us, right? So why do we call them aliens? Why do we try to find life outside Earth? By finding a pool of water and a boat inside it, or something like that, right? With a little guy fishing, right? That's exactly how we try to detect life outside our planet. By radio emissions. Look at this. Just think about it. We're thinking about the transmissions of thought, and our telescopes are radio sensor, like they're radio sensors, so they detect frequency in the radio range, like your FM radio, for example, right? Will we ever find that? Unless we find an archaic society like ours, which still depends on radio signaling somewhere, maybe, right? But the reality is, they're not aliens, extraterrestrial, whatever you call them. There are spirits everywhere in the universe, each one of them adapted to their own environment. The vast majority of them we can't see, because their spiritual bodies are different from ours. You know, they're probably lighter. You know, we can't see. They can be different shapes. They're adapted to the environment. So if they live in the planet X, who requires them to have this particular arrangement in their material principle, that's exactly what they're going to have. And my camera is not detected. My eyes are not going to detect it. But they're there. And they're probably making fun of those little robots that were standing there. It's like, what is this? But the reality is, we tend to tackle the question of life outside planet Earth in a very awkward way. The same way we used to tackle the question about God a few hundred years ago. It never changed. So we don't change in general. We change very slowly. Like, it takes a long time. So that's the parallel I started in the beginning. Going back in 1868 and describing our society today, the parallels are all there. So, you know, when people, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we still believed in spirit. Remember, almost every single religion in this planet believes in the existence of some immaterial form of existence, which you can call spirit or soul or anything you want to call it, but all of them believe in the same essence. So this tells us that the source is coming from above, right? So obviously someone much above us is throwing that information to us. So we acquire it in different ways, in different tastes, right? But the information is out there. So the answer is yes, there's life everywhere in the universe. Everywhere. You know what people used to believe in the past is that when it used to rain, so I think it's important for you guys to know this because you understand why we see things the way we see today. So in the beginning, people used to think that the sky was actually a very hard concave panel that would hold a lot of water on top of it. Do you know the word firmament comes from? Firm is like firm. And is an arrangement of a firm substance that will hold water. Occasionally, water would drip from it, and it was rain. Yes. Isn't that amazing? So that's how we used to think from the past, right? It sounds kind of hilarious for us today to think that way. Almost it sounds hilarious to us to try to find an external source of life driving around in a weird disk that floats everywhere and super speeds. That's exactly the same thing we're doing right now. It's hilarious. Hilarious, the same thing. So we don't change. We change, but we change very, 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 very slowly. Like our minds are still incredibly fixated on things that we find so amazing, right? And what's the next frontier? Humanity is always like that. We always find the next frontier that we're gonna be this very. Looking at extraterrestrial beings today, it's almost like when the first people that left Europe in boats found a narwhal whale. Do you know what a narwhal whale is? A whale that has a very long structure in the center of the head, which is actually a tooth. It's not a horn. It's actually a tooth. It's an adapted tooth that comes right in the middle of the eyes and goes up and can get up to 1 meter long or so. Any guesses of an animal that has this very long, like alternating pointy horn in the middle of the forehead? What do we call it?
Unicorn.
Perfect. So, just to show you, we're living exactly the same scenario, but now with different questions, right? At that point in time, someone looked at a narwhal, described it as a monster that has some sort of horn in the center of the forehead, and then it got adapted, transmutated into a horse that got the same horn, and then is this type of a mystical being that no one ever sees, but it's there, and all of a sudden we have a unicorn. So we're still finding unicorns. But unicorns today, we try to find them as UFOs or beings or little green guys moving around like a jelly, like big eyes. Those are the unicorns of today. Just to make us think about this. Now, hopefully, a few hundred years from today, someone will look at the same question again and say, wow, there is indeed life everywhere in the universe. There's actually no vacuum universe because the universe is composed of a type of cosmic fluid that I cannot detect, right? Because I cannot detect, I call it vacuum. See how hilarious that is? So I'll give you another example. So I have, my dad had a little, you probably remember that. It's like a little TV. It looked like a radio that had a little screen on the side, so we're able to tune into channels, right? So it's almost like I'm bringing this TV now here today, and I'm trying to get CNN live on it, right? I'm just moving this dial around, and there's fuzzy things on the screen. It's like, see, there's something there. There's like a unicorn, right? But yeah, I know there's a channel going on there. I can't detect it. So my archaic instruments can't even get close to understand a digital signal, right? Now we can. We have digital TV and radio everywhere. But 30 years ago, we didn't. So we're living 30 years ago in regards of this. Okay? So where did I get all the information? Surprisingly enough, right here. A lot of the other examples, of course, come from history books and stuff, but the idea of a universal cosmic fluid that connects all of us, it's so easy to prove. I'll give you one example. So if the universe was really like void of everything, how would our thought move along the universe? So every type of energy needs to have some type of fluid that supports it, right? So if you go into a vacuum and yell, who's going to listen to you? No one. Okay? So that's why Star Wars movies are fun, because you can hear explosions and all sorts of stuff, but you don't hear anything. Because sound needs a fluid, needs a support, needs something that vibrates and resonates with that, so we can hear each other. So in our case here, it's air, right? So it goes through air. So if you think that same parallel and put into our thoughts now, okay? How many of you had the experience of calling someone, all of a sudden say, I need to call this person, and then you call and the other person say, hey, I was just thinking about you? Does that happen? How does that happen? Luck? Chance? I don't think so. Right? Somehow you guys are connected. Who's connecting you guys? Internet? Maybe. What's up? Yeah. Just think about the basic things first. Remember I gave you the example of us talking to each other through sound and air, right? So if we're talking through our thoughts, because we do, right? So we need an energy and we need a medium, right? So in our case, now that with the Genesis, it's very easy to understand because we're actually all connected to the universal cosmic fluid, and thought is an energy, is a form of energy. So if I project my thoughts into the universal cosmic fluid, they will hit the person that I'm actually thinking about, to a point that I can actually be there with that person through my projection of my thoughts. When do we do that? When we pray. When we pray about someone, let's say I'm really praying, connecting all my energies through that thought, and I'm projecting this energy into a person that is really in need, right? I'm actually right there at that moment, because I'm channeling through all the energies of my perispiritual body. I'm modeling my thought into the spiritual fluid, and I'm projecting that through the universal cosmic fluid into that person. And that connects so deeply into that person that the person may even think about me at that time. That's what happens. How can we explain that without knowing this? There's no way to explain. So if you go now, and some people will say, Marco, I completely disagree with you, because science has proven to us a million different ways that the universe is an empty space, and that is just random. So we think about each other randomly. Okay, and I understand that, because I cannot create an experiment to replicate that in science models. Science models needs a control, a positive control, a negative control, like a method that's reproducible. I need to count and measure that, and I need to report it, right? That's how science works. So in things related to the spiritual principle and the energy related to the spiritual principle, those steps are impossible to replicate in vitro. So that's why it's so hard for science to bring in that knowledge at this point. And this is what Genesis does. The Genesis, what it does from beginning to end, is talk about those principles together, how they interact with each other, and how is the universal cosmic fluid so important for that. I'll tell you one example that's bringing us closer to understanding this, okay? Because the material principle can be as light as a perispiritual body and as heavy as a rock. That's the same material principle, right? That's the same of creation. So some of you are probably thinking right now, Marco, that now you totally blew me now, because I can't think about material principle in such a variety of forms and shapes and weights and all that. So I'll give you one example. So matter we know by science now that is formed by atoms, right? And atoms have multiple little parts. I'm not going to go in detail, but you can split it apart in subatomic particles now, and those subatomic particles can be even split in tiny little particles that go even beyond that. Okay, so one of those particles has recently been described and actually measured and detected. It's called Higgs boson, and it's thought to give weight to matter. So in a way that you're able to isolate that from the atom will be in a fluidic state that has no weight, scalable weight to it. Does that sound like the pure spirit? That sounds exactly like a pure spirit to me, which is a type of matter that I cannot see, detect, or weight, but exists. You know, it may be that the constitution of the subatomic particles of the spiritual body is just different, right? And that's what we understand today in science. But for example, if I'm an atom and I'm the nucleus right here, the first electron surrounding me will be going in Dundas Street. That's how it works. So indeed, matter is full of empty, if you think that way, right? So if I compress the whole universe, and this is Stephen Hawking's now, if I compress that entire universe into one little thingy, it will be about the size of a golf ball or something. It's how much empty space there's out there. Believe it or not. And we still think that matter is really matter, right? We knock it like this is matter. It's just a funny aggregation of energy. It's here. It says that right here, that matter is a type of agglutination of energy. And now we prove that scientifically, very recently, right? Just to show you how interesting that is. And so, you know, I don't have too much, I know I probably went way overboard on my first slide, but, you know, this is really like the three main topics of the book, the Genesis. So the first parts talk about, you know, creation of God that we talked about today, good and evil. And now we understand, and just to summarize, that evil is just a temporary absence of good. So there are actually no two forces out there that clash against each other. The yin and yang type of theory, it only occurs with us because we are on the stage that we still have some type of evilness and goodness inside us. But the fact is that that's completely temporary and it's irrelevant for the universe. In a universe, in a macro scale, goodness is always there. Evil is that when goodness is not there yet, right? Uranography, for those who don't know, is the study of the sky and the development of the stars. So that's uranography. And he talks about all the stars and the celestial bodies. It's very interesting, actually. The Genesis, in the organic perspective, when the little first cell was created, like little protein was created in the soup that was the ocean, and then that protein connected to another protein, and then they hanged out, and they form a complex protein. That complex protein developed an enzymatic capacity, so it degraded another protein. That's how life started. We know that. That's science. But now they show exactly the same thing here. So the Genesis never contradicts science anywhere. And that's the basis of Spiritism. If you find something that contradicts what we're telling you, and that's true, go ahead and follow it. You know, I haven't found it, and I was probably the biggest skeptic of our universe before this. So you know, we'll see. So it talks about spiritual evolution. I don't have time to talk about it, but if you look, Emmanuel talks about it. Chico Xavier talks about it too. That how our own spirit evolves. Because it's the same pattern, same way the universe evolves, our spirit evolves. You know, every single organic thing in our planet has a vital principle that allows us to live. That's the difference between a leaf that is live and a dead leaf. So if you look at them both side by side, so one has a vital principle, the other one not. And that's part of how we use the universal cosmic fluid to generate life into things, right? we talk about a little bit of Mosaic Genesis, which is actually very interesting because there's a lot of truth in it. There's a lot of correct things in the Mosaic Genesis. It's just obviously the Mosaic Genesis was given to a population that could only understand Mosaic Genesis, right? So Adam, Eve, eating the, and when they ate, they disobeyed God's law, and they ate the apple, and then they, that's all. There's a lot there that we can talk about. And then the second part is about miracles in the gospel and the fluids. Now, I'll use my last 5 minutes or so to talk about things that are really related to Spiritism, particularly, which is mediumship, healings, dreams, and all this interesting phenomena that follows Spiritism that probably attracts a lot of people to it, right? So, for example, healing mediums, right? We have so many healing mediums out there. How does that happen, right? And I'm talking about the real ones, right? So, if you understand the way God created this type of energy that is undetectable, we call this universal cosmic fluid. It can be manipulated in many different ways by the action of the spirit and the thought. So I can aggregate it, I can concentrate it, I can give patterns and shapes to it. So when we are self-incarnated here, when I'm standing here, what you're seeing is a 3-layer component of a being. One is my spirit that animates my thoughts and myself. The second part is my spiritual body, which is this aggregation of physical elements that shape this spirit to fit my body. And then that paraspiritual body-spirit combination animates my body by connecting deeply into every aspect of it and transmitting the spirit thought directly to my body through the paraspirit. So I can actually do things, I can move my hands, I can act, right? So that's how we're formed. Now, the paraspiritual body is deeply connected to the fluids of the universe too. So technically, when I'm doing passes, for example, so what happens is I'm being assisted by another spirit, which transfuses into me very pure, elevated energies that are then through my body and through my own material and physical body and through my spirit are channeled through the other person. So the person that's finally in the end receiving that energy is receiving a transfusion of very good energies. So the only way you can replace bad energies, let's put it that way, is by really pushing through a lot of goodness. So that's what the pass is doing. It's like I'm just pushing through as much as I can that good vibration, that good energy. But that's all animated through a combination of several fluids and my energies, the spiritual energies from me and from the spirits. Now, if the person receiving the passes is completely disconnected from that fluidic state, from that energy or from the environment, whatever I do will just hit the dead wall. It will just be dissipated immediately, okay? Because we need to be connected. And the connection occurs through the universal cosmic fluid, right? And through our thoughts. Remember that. We just talked about it, right? So if we're all aligned and connected, elevating our thoughts to good things, let's say we always say, think about, think God, elevate your thoughts to Jesus. What we're doing that way is allowing you to connect to the source of those energies. So when we deliver the good energy to you, you'll be able to receive and accept it, right? So that's how it works. So the Genesis explains in very, very detail what exactly happens during that time. It also explains to us, for example, in the mediumistic communication, what happens. So in the medium, he's able to expand his spiritual body and establish a direct thought communication with other spirits that do not have a body, so discarnate spirits, right? And the thought of the discarnate spirit can flow straight into the medium, and the medium can either write it or say it, or, it can, depending on how deep that connection is, even the pattern of voice, the pattern of writing, the tone, the intensity, this facial figures, it's a range. So we're going to have either from the one that's just hinted by the thought and write what he hears or understands, to the medium that is so deeply connected to the other spirit that almost the entirety of the emotions and and behaviors and the writing and all the little ticks, anything that the other spirit has will just be completely passed through, and the medium will be pretty much a representation of that other person. The other person is never inside the medium, though. Just be careful with that, right? It's not that the medium, the spirit comes in and kicks out the medium, it's like sits there, it's like, okay, I'm gonna write this. No, it's all about the spirit's communication, right? Which is all about thoughts. Okay, so that's always explained here too in details how that energy relationship occurs. You know, dreams and many other things. And in the end, the book finishes with the prophecies in light of Spiritism. So it evaluates the prophecies that are in the Bible and what does that mean. And I'll give you an example. So I know many of you have heard about people that can actually predict the future, right? It's something that occurs. It's real. Many times it's real. But how does that happen? So in Genesis, I'll just give you a little summary of that. So Kardec explains in a very interesting way. So if I'm going through this very treacherous pathway, lots of mountains everywhere, and I can only see this little narrow piece of road, section of road in front of me, I have no idea what's coming up the next curve. So I'm just going my pathway. Okay, just picture yourself in that scenario. Now, there is this individual sitting on top of one of those mountains. So from that vantage point, he's able to see my entire road, or at least a good section of my own path. And he can see someone who's about to, let's say, rob me in the road. He's waiting for me, an ambush. He can actually go back to me and say, hey, buddy, listen, you know, something's going to happen to you. You know, it's not good, right? It's waiting for you. Next curve, okay? I don't know if I'm even going to get to that curve, right? There's a lot of uncertainties in the trip, but in general line is that if we continue the same trajectory, I'm going to be mugged by this individual, okay? So that person is not a miracle. It's not a superhuman being. It's anything different than what we understand. It's just that the vantage points are different. So when we talk about predicting future in our level of understanding, it's simply that we're talking about different vantage points at the same story. It may or may not happen, but if it's permitted by the divine providence, and if it does not affect your free will, yes, you can actually receive hints of what's about to happen in the future. And some people can do that very well. Okay? But it's not allowed when it affects your capacity to decide by yourself. Because then it takes away your ability to grow. If I'm being told, and a lot of people ask me all the time, so tell me what to do. So I'm in trouble right now. So tell me what to do. I'm like, I cannot tell you what to do. But I can tell you this and this and that, which is like the core understanding of who we are and what we should do in life. And then you can make your own decision. That's learning. Okay? If I keep telling you like, oh, you got to do this. Oh, we got to do that. Oh, don't do that. So in the end, I'm taking away the chance of that individual to actually better themselves. Because they're not exerting the number one gift that we receive, which is our free will. Okay, so that's really a summary of the Genesis. The book is phenomenal. It probably will take a long time to read the first time because it's very complex. There's a lot of terminology that you have to Google all the time. Before we say use the dictionary, now it's like Wikipedia, you know. But it's a very interesting way for you to understand all the other books in Spiritism, even the Medium's book, the Spirit's book, because it provide you a lot of the technicalities behind a lot of the answers on the other books. Okay. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you, and I think if you have a couple questions, I'll be happy to. I stay here.
So
okay.
Any questions or comments?
Yes.
Yes, I have.
Go ahead.
You will repeat the question.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
One that's a little bit more simple is about passes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it explicitly written in the Genesis
Mm-hmm.
about that we should do that as a spiritist, and if not, do you know if it's written in any other spiritist reference?
Yes.
And my second question would be, you started talking about time, right? That
Mhm.
time only coexists when
Yeah.
we have matter.
Yeah.
So I think it's logical to think that in the spiritual world, there might not be such a thing as time. If there is no such a thing as time, is it correct for us to say that it's going to take us billion of years to become perfect spirits, to become as close to Jesus as possible? Because if there is no time, it just means that this is just a concept. So there is no point in discussing that, oh, this is going to take forever. This is just our human representation. So that's something that goes over my head sometimes, and I'd love to hear.
Okay, so 2 questions. So the first one is that, is there anywhere in Genesis that we actually say that we need to give passes? And the second question is, well, consider time is all relative to who you are, to where you live, or to your understanding of time itself. Like, is that fair to say that will take X amount of time for you to be a perfect spirit, right? So for the first question, passes have been present in humanity way before Spiritism. Jesus was one of the good examples of it, right? Laying hands, or just not even putting the hands, but projecting the thoughts, which is kind of the same idea. He could do it from a distance. He didn't need the hands he needed. But even before that, we have drawings from like early humanity that show depicted individuals extending hands onto heads of other people, like a blessing type of thing. So that's not different from any passes that we do here. I think the only difference here is that we're able to understand it in a way that allows us to optimize the situation to do it. But, passes, it happens like routinely everywhere, like even
other religions.
Yeah, even other religions do it, right? So practice the same thing. So yes, it's written about passes in this book. Passes are not. So remember, Spiritism is not about rules. It's quite the opposite of it. It's about concepts and how you understand the concepts to be a better person. So it never says in any Spirit's book that you have to do it. Never. It will never do it. Remember we talked about, so it will never say, okay, you got to do this, right? Because this is what you do to get that way. It doesn't. But it describes, remember, the author of the book comes from the study of energetic transmissions between bodies. So that's what he studied before. So he does believe firmly in passes, right? Like many other religions. And now we understand from the spirits now, understanding what is it? Well, what are you doing when you're doing passes, right? So that's what he talks about. So he talks about what type of energy is involved, how is it involved, and what we need to do. But the bottom line is that none of the techniques of the passes are really needed if you have the perfect understanding of what it is and the perfect situation when you use it. It's like doing my hand like this or that, or like flipping around and doing noises and sound and things. That's completely irrelevant. And that's what he talks about pretty much here. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is about time. So in the spiritual world, time is completely different from our understanding of timing, 100%. Because, even their life cycles are different. Like a spirit that does not live in a place that is illuminated by sun had no idea what a day or a month or a transition time is, right? So that's exactly that's the core of Spiritism. So to tell you that we know we're going to get there. That we know. That's unquestionable. But putting a timestamp to it is a big mistake. You can do it in a day, you can do it in a month, or you can do it in, I don't know. Like, I cannot give you an answer for that. So just to show you that how time is completely unrelated to what we are, it's completely different in where the scenario were. So when you're living here, you measure time in a specific way. You discriminate in the spiritual world. All of a sudden, everything you know about time is wrong, right? Because they don't measure time the way we do. But if you think that we are eternal beings, that in itself is a statement against you to keep track of time in that sense of how long it's going to do it. The message, the bottom line message is as do the best you can every time to be a better person. That's how you recognize a good spiritist. Remember when Kardec asked, how do you recognize a good spiritist? By the efforts that an individual is doing to improve themselves. He never talks about time, right? Because time is completely irrelevant. I completely agree with you. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a risk, because these days we notice there's a very that is a huge increase in terms of evolution.
Yes.
In technology and intelligence
Mhm.
and all the information that we're getting better and better in terms of understanding what it is.
Yeah.
And the risk of not going the same way in the moral evolution.
Yeah.
Is there a risk, an imbalance there too?
Yeah, I think that's
Can
a
you repeat the question?
yeah. So the question is, so we're technology-wise, we're developing an incredibly fast pace, and the question is there a chance that spiritually, morally speaking, we're not actually doing the same type of evolution, right? That's a very good question. So I think the short answer for that is that eventually everything will catch up, and we know that, right? But the pattern of how it happens, it really changes over time. So there are many moments in our own history of humanity that moral aspects were tipped over science, and then others that the science is really tipped over the moral. What I like to understand, the way I see it, is that at the same time, technology is allowing me to do things in the moral aspects that I were not able to do before. I'll give you an example, right? So remember when we have the tsunami, right? In the 2000, I don't remember now exactly, but 200,000 people died, right? And Thailand and the other islands. So if that happened without technology, we would not even know about that. That would be a completely isolated situation that 200,000 spiritists created according to a specific plan that they had that I have no idea what it is. What changed is that technology allowed the entire planet to resonate in the energy of sending good vibrations to those people. Do you think that affected morally? I can guarantee you it did. It touched everyone. It touched everyone to a point that at least for 2 seconds, someone thought about those victims. And those 2 seconds are going to be counted in their evolution because they sent back a thought of love. Right? So I think in the end, everything will be balanced out. So I'm not concerned about it, but I think in general, Spiritism does not. And there's nothing in Spiritism that suggests that there's going to be a disconnect in that.
All right. I think because of our time, maybe just one more, if there's any. And Marco is going to be here as well afterwards. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Marco.
Yes.
Just a quick question. Going back to Genesis.
Yes.
If we go to the Adam and Eve story.
Yes.
Is there a symbolism in Genesis with Adam and Eve and as to why they were
Yes, there is. I actually have an entire lecture on it, but I'll just I'll just try to summarize as much as possible, right? So actually, I have. Okay, so I have no, that's just the Genesis. So this is the symbolism of it, right? So we started as Adam representing the creation. So it's the creation of a spirit that incarnates into a body and is able to use his free will. Right? So that's a representation. Okay? So that spirit, and then Eve, we like to think, oh, there's a boy and a girl after. Like, at that time, that didn't matter, right? So that was a very male-dominant society, so that was exactly what people would understand, right? So male-dominant society to generate Eve. Eve's generated from the rib cage, right? Which means, in the end, is not that she's part of, exactly, we're all the same. So bodies are all, matter-wise, bodies are generated exactly the same. They have the same principles, right? So when they're created as individuals allowed to use their free will, they're always going to be tested by different scenarios where you're going to have to make decisions using your free will. So they had to make the decision based on the influence of the environment. That's what we do on a daily basis. So that represents the serpent. Right? That asked them, oh, you should do it, Oh, but God tell me not to do, but you decided, yeah, I'll go there and do it, right? So, and then when they decide using the free will that we're going to take that risk, they have the consequences of it. So it is what they're showing, depicting the law of God. The law of God is immutable and perfect. If you try to test it, if you go against it, there's a reciprocal force that pushes you back from it until you align with the law of God. So if you align with the law of love, then there's no tests of the law anymore. Like, you don't have to go back and forth and test it and try and error and do a mistake and do it again, because you be that representation of the law. So those two characters will basically show to us that even from inception, from the very first spirits that incarnated into bodies into this planet, we always have the free will, We always know the laws. We know the laws because remember, they knew the law. God told us it's inside your conscience, right? All of us have, right? It's inside their conscience, the law of God, but they will be exposed to situations that they have to make decisions, use the free will, and they will learn. So they've learned, right? Obviously, in a very interesting, description of things. But they learned that, you cannot attain against the law of God, and there's a consequence to it. Basically, that's how it started. I mean, there's a lot of other fine details on it, but that's kind of the core of the message. That we're all the same. We're all created equal. We have the ability to think and to decide, and one day we understand that the perfection of the law of God will really be our final destination, right? So that's it.
All right, thank you, everyone. Is there any comment or suggestion from the internet? So at this moment, we will thank our friends from the internet as well for joining us. We're gonna move on to the passes in a minute. So it's a moment that for those who are here for the first time, we reduce the